spaces, and I think I met the one and only geriatric nurse practitioner in all of Montana earlier today. So there's some challenges in sort of seeding the world with information about the topic of this conference. I have to apologize. What's on your jump drive is not what you're going to be seeing here, but it'll be very easy to get this to you too, and I'll get it to Natalie, and I can be emailed and I can send it. Okay, so I like your topic about living well with chronic illness, and I thought I would add wherever seniors live. Once I heard that a good way to live well in old age is to get a chronic disease and take really good care of it. And so I've been thinking about there might be some truth in that, being under some sort of general care for the one or more chronic diseases people have. My father lived to 102 with a whole bunch of chronic diseases and in pretty good health. And he used to say that the best way to predict that you could live to be 100 was to live to be 99. And there is some truth to that too. So what I'm going to, there really is, the best predictor of anything, depression, functional status, is what that status was at some earlier time. So obviously age predicts age. That's the researcher in me speaking. So I was going to talk a little, this is a kind of a full talk. If the time runs out before I'm finished, I tried to put the most important things I wanted to say up front. But I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by long-term care, and it's also known as long-term support services, long-term supportive services. That's what people with disabilities prefer to call it. Then we're going to talk a little bit about quality of life, about various care settings and having consumer choice or patient choice or person choice within those settings. We'll look a little bit setting by setting, look at new approaches, and then look at perhaps some new roles for professionals. See if we can accomplish all that. I'm going to get in the way of accomplishing my agenda by starting out bringing some cases or stories to light. I like the idea that you're all going to write up stories because I think stories are very helpful in this world of long-term support service and chronic illness. So the first story I want to tell you is about Mrs. S., Pearl S. In 2004, when I'm starting this story, she was 89 years old. She lived at home. She spent the winter in Florida. She spent the summer at a summer cottage that had belonged to her father, where the whole extended family came. Her caregiver was her 96-year-old husband, who was 8 years older than she was. She didn't have any children living in the same city where she lived, though a lot of nieces and nephews. She had had breast cancer, in fact, a double mastectomy when she was 70, a recurrence. It was really a new primary on the site, treated with radiation therapy about 10 years later. She had osteoporosis, but she managed to live without falling until the very end of her life, as she did sustain some compression fractures that were very painful at the end of her life. How many people in this room are nurses? Almost everybody. How many are physicians? Nobody. So you all know the nurse language better than I do. She also had memory loss over the last 10 years of her life. It was gradual to the point where she had little recent memory. She would get highly anxious at times, but she was oriented for who she was, and she recognized people, and her remote memory was fine. And at the time this story begins, she weighed only 78 pounds. She didn't eat very much. She didn't do much around the house. And here's another person, Mr. S., who we pick him up in 2008, and he was 100 years old at the time. He had some chronic illnesses too. He had macular degeneration, which by that time rendered him legally blind. He had renal disease, which had been identified about 4 years before, chronic asymptomatic renal insufficiency. He was operating with about 9% of his kidney, diagnosed even earlier than that. And he was ambulatory alert. He had a faulty gag reflex that would make him choke from time to time, very unpleasant for him. But if you look at them, it's sort of, they may look a little different from what you expect when you hear the history. There's Mrs. S. over there. The year she died, she was at a wedding, her grandson's wedding, and it was late at night. He was marrying a young woman from Mexico, so she had the piñata in her hand. She had a fur coat, though it was sweltering weather in July because she was so thin and she was so cold. And she's dancing with Mr. S. a year before that at another wedding. And here's Mr. S. getting ready for his 100th birthday party at a family cottage. These people are husband and wife. Here he is swimming in the river that, which is when he was about 98, I guess it was, and I'm in the background there too. And here he is at his 100th party, and he's singing Young at Heart. He had learned, he had memorized those words. He knew the song from before. The guy holding the mic is his paid helper. Now, I know those people really well. There's Mr. S. again dancing through his last decade with his daughter-in-law, with my daughter, because these are my parents, okay? So do I get credit for telling a story, or do I have to write it up? So what I'd like to take the second to do is to think about kind of the aspects of their life and then the healthcare issues and how they were intertwined. My mother managed to stay at home until she had one long hospitalization. My parents are Canadians, and they have the benefit of Canadian healthcare. And she was in the hospital for a couple months at the end of her life because dropping her diet from 2 Ensures a day and 1 Power Bar and a little bit of orange juice to just 1 Ensure, and maybe she didn't take the orange juice, that got her dehydrated, and she wound up in the hospital. And then she had a geriatric workup at that time, and then she broke her hip while she was in the hospital. So it was a two-month hospitalization, a very short nursing home stay, and then she died. In that period, she had almost no formal care. She pretty well never missed any of those weddings where she was dancing. She went around to other cities for family events. She was everybody's Aunt Pearl. And when she died, it was complications of a hip fracture that she sustained in the hospital and a downward spiral. By the way, that picture of my mother in the fur coat, that one was being developed around the time she was in the hospital, so we had all those wedding pictures, and I was showing them to various nurses and doctors in the hospital, and they said, how long ago was that? You know, how young was she then? Well, I mean, it was only about 3-4 weeks before. They weren't ready to see her that way because they were seeing her in bed in a nightgown, and they saw her as the sum total of all her problems, not somebody who was an important person at her grandson's wedding. And that's a hard thing to pull together. There was a lot of things. I haven't gotten around to writing a book about my parents. My husband wrote a book about my mother-in-law, which is called Long-Term Care, It Shouldn't Be This Way. And he described the issues involved with her from the time she had a stroke while living alone in Florida until the time she died in a nursing home in New York State. And in between, she had been in rehab in New York. She had been in 2 assisted living centers. She had had a bunch of doctors. And my husband is an expert in geriatric medicine, writes textbooks and so on. And he couldn't sort of bring it together. And so he wrote a book about that, how the different pieces didn't work together. And if he couldn't make it happen with all his knowledge and all his connections, because he knew people in Florida and he knew people in New York, then how can anybody? We've got a system that's really hard, whether it's Minnesota or Montana. Now, I haven't gotten around to writing a book like that about my parents, though I think about it from time to time. But there are some things I learned about my mother's care. They never did, my mother believed in doctors. She really did. She was the original compliant patient. She did everything doctors said, more or less, until she got too agitated to wear a hearing aid and so. But she really believed in doctors. She followed up. She kept all her appointments. Somebody was following her in a cancer clinic. Someone was following her for osteoporosis. She had her primary care doctor, who was very nice, who saw her at least once a year. Nobody knew she had dementia. They couldn't pick up on it. Finally, I told the primary care doctor. Then she picked up on it. Then she referred her to geriatrics in the last year of Mother's life. But the doctor said, oh, you know, everything's been so busy with your mother as far as the cancer referrals and the osteoporosis. When she got to the hospital, the thing that amazed me was that the geriatric team, she was found 2 reasons why she wasn't eating that weren't because of the dementia. I mean, that just blew my mind because, as you know, the best research says that a lot of people stop eating and lose weight when they have dementia. A guy named Jack Schnelly, where do I want to say he's from? I think he moved to Atlanta. He used to be at UCLA. Jack did detailed studies in Los Angeles about eating with people with dementia in nursing homes, doing all sorts of things to entice them to eat, eating at all times, finger foods available, all that good stuff, finding what they like to eat, and found that 50% of the people they worked with did gain weight and 50% just didn't. It was dementia-related loss of weight. There didn't seem to be much you could do about it. So the doctors said she could possibly have a problem with sludge in her common bile duct, and that could be corrected. And they thought, oh, that's about a 10% chance. But that does, they got onto this because she had some weird liver values when she was admitted to medical service. And they said that might have been because of that. And yes, you could do laparoscopic surgery, and yes, you could clean it out, and that might improve her appetite. They said, on the other hand, she could have some kind of malignancy that caused the liver damage, and then you couldn't do much about it. Well, guess what? She had both of them. She did end up with the laparoscopic surgery. She did end up hungry and eating. She did have the sludge. But other things happened to her, including breaking her hip while she was in the hospital. And when she broke the hip, they decided to do a bone marrow biopsy that they wouldn't have done otherwise, and they found she had B-cell lymphoma too, that was going to limit her life to just a few more years no matter what happened. So it's interesting to me that there were 2 medical reasons, and yet we usually say, well, this is just dementia. So I learned something from that. My mother became incredibly deconditioned in the hospital after the geriatric team did their good things. She had a urinary catheter that she probably shouldn't have had, and that kept her lying in bed. And I must say, the nurses didn't want to take it out. They were, and that was a mistake. She got all sorts of horrible problems while in the acute hospital. And part of that was the silo thing. The orthopedic doctor who did the operation said she shouldn't be weight-bearing for a month because he said she was so thin, so fragile, pinning the hip was like hammering a nail into rotten wood. We better keep her lying down. And so that, it was acting on that they were worried about all sorts of things. She got a little decubitus ulcer on her tailbone while she was waiting for the surgery. They were worried about getting it infected. She was never, ever, ever incontinent. She had all her ADL functions, but very, very slow. So it really bothered her to have that catheter. So we went through all that, and then when I was ready to take her out of there, I called the orthopedic surgeon. It was about 4 days short of his verdict of not being weight-bearing for a month. And I said, can she be weight-bearing? And he said, I don't know, how's she walking? So he forgot all that. Everything that we had done to do what he had in mind, and it was all unnecessary. So I got her out of there on her feet with the catheter finally out, but it was pretty bad. And eventually she died of a coronary embolism. My dad, I don't want to belabor